On the first cool evening of September 1944, the father of a 9-year-old boy thumped his fist on the front door of a modest home in the southeastern Ukraine town of Stry. The 32-year-old matriarch inside knew what she was about to hear before she touched the latch. The threat of punishment, knowing it would come, but not exactly when, had become an ever-present reality for her. The man whispered in the widening seam of the door, "Get out, now. They're coming for you." The woman's 6-year-old daughter clung to the back of her mother's skirt, shielding herself from the man and his news. While she did not completely understand his message, his urgent hush told the little girl everything she needed to know. People whispered just before the soldiers came. Only hours before, all had proceeded as prescribed by the authorities. The performance space at the town's gymnasium filled to capacity with parents and grandparents, uncles and aunts, and the special honorable guest in attendance. A representative from the Soviet Republic had come to evaluate the elementary indoctrination of the town's youth into the global Soviet system. Thankfully, the school teacher's direction of the student assembly executed flawlessly. The songs expertly curated, the play energetically delivered and exactly as ordered, at the pinnacle of the performance, a beautiful ode to Father Stalin. It hit just the right note, with a remarkably memorized recitation by a boy with a pitch-perfect sense of drama. You could feel the pressure of the room release with the completion of his last poetic syllable. They had passed the test. But in the microsecond between the end of the performance at the final round of applause, and just as the monitor was about to signal his approval with his departure, the boy went off script. "I just recited you a poem that I was ordered to read," he announced. "Now I will sing you a song that I want to sing." The faces in the crowd flushed. When the boy finished his singing, "Stria ne verma Ukraina," Ukraine has not perished, he looked directly at his father to gauge his approval. Upon seeing his stunned and ghostly expression, he turned directly to the teacher for her validation. The boy's desire to be acknowledged gave the teacher's resistance to the occupation away. But for the 120-odd seconds that it took for him to sing that song, her underground rebellion remained undetected. The monitor had failed to look on the back of her classroom's brand new official map and find the teacher's secret curriculum. And he had missed the Ukrainian national flag that she'd neatly stashed in the bottom of her shoe bin. All such contraband would now be discovered as he ransacked her classroom with a fresh eye. The teacher glanced at the frowning Soviet official. She winced a nervous, apologetic, "kids these days" kind of a smile. But she knew by his expression that all was certainly lost. He wasn't buying it. She understood that in the end, she'd be held responsible for the boy's brazen performance, and now everyone in the school and in the community would pay for it dearly. She was proud of her young pupil, and yet devastated that his naive courage would result in the destruction of her and his home. She told this to the whispering father now at her door. The trembling man put his hands on her shoulders to deliver the inevitable. "We're sorry, but the monitor beat him and insisted on finding out what you were teaching. He told him everything. The map, the flag, everything." He turned to leave, muttering over his shoulder desperate pleas. "You must leave. They're coming for you. Quickly, run. Get out." The school teacher's clinging daughter understood the words "get out," but the 6-year-old did not understand the impact or magnitude. A verdict of dissident activity was a certain ticket to the Norilsk re-education camp, if you were pitied enough to not be shot. More and more of the Stry's townspeople disappeared as the days fell under occupation, one after the other. The school teacher took a moment. Then she put her mind to how to best protect her family and her daughter. "Sit, Duchka, over there at the kitchen table." She shepherded the girl away from the front door and to her favorite chair. She needed to gather the indispensable things and leave in the remaining minutes before the authorities arrived. Her husband was still at work in the warehouse, which was just at the end of the cobblestone road. He'd be home shortly. She retreated to the bedroom and pulled the family trunk out from under the bed. She loaded the photo albums, embroidery, clothing, her jewelry box, and other important documents. She grabbed her daughter's clothing and all the dry food in the house. Then she pulled the kilim from the hearth in the living room. Her mother had woven the rug by hand. In her last act before leaving her birthplace forever, she pulled a chair up to the front door and stepped up gently to lift the wooden crucifix off of the nail above the transom. The growl of her husband's truck rumbled to the front door. She did not take time to wipe the tears streaming from her eyes as she hurriedly told him the story. He embraced her, and together they worked quickly a charted plan. When she draped the red and black kilim into the bed of the truck, he grabbed the handles of the overstuffed trunk and heaved the heavy box up. They stuffed the passenger side of the cab with potatoes and bags of wheat and flour. In 20-odd minutes, they'd gathered and packed the essentials. The truck sputtered and spat, struggling with the extra weight as it grinded up the first hill, heading west. With no room in the cab, mother and daughter lay in the back of the truck. The space was enough for the little girl, but the mother's knees ached, her legs propped on the canisters of gasoline. The cool fall air began to penetrate through their coats, so mother and daughter rolled the edge of the rug up over their bodies to shield them from the draft as the truck heaved forward. They traded their truck and the remaining gasoline for a wagon and 2 oxen on their second day on the run. The days grew shorter. Fall turned to winter. Her mother's kilim kept them warm in the woods. They'd moved into the mountains to escape detection. Now there was no more food for the oxen, so they traded the oxen to the mountain man for a 2-wheeled handcart to carry their dwindling family heirlooms. Then they traded their heirlooms for meat, bread, and a dry night's sleep. All the while they evaded the Nazis moving into the territory from the west and the Russians squeezing in from the east. It was deep winter now. The food was all gone, as were most of their possessions. The kilim was now draped over the cart, straddling both sidewalls, and the daughter lay nestled between a layer of the wool inside the cart with the rug on top of her as father pulled it along. The only benefit of the cold was that the frozen ground made for easier pulling, until the snow came. Eventually, their luck ran out. A Russian sentry ordered them out of their makeshift shelter at gunpoint. He stared briefly at the 3, assessing the threat. He was used to finding these sorts of ragged leftovers from the bitter fighting. People had scattered everywhere. Their homes had been entered, commandeered for Russian and Nazi officers, their food stolen, their loved ones shot or raped. Those who escaped headed for the hills. People like this were everywhere in the woods. He separated them from their cart that held their meager belongings and marched them toward his encampment. The mother looked at the father as she kept her hand on the little girl's head. They knew their time was short. During the interrogation, they were asked to produce their citizenship papers, which they'd been forced to leave back at their cart. They were not allowed to retrieve them. In a matter of minutes, they were declared enemies of the Russian state and condemned to death. The officer ordered the young sentry soldier who'd found them to take them to the usual place and carry out the sentencing. Now, as they walked to their deaths, the mother sank her right hand into her inside coat pocket to clutch the crucifix that she'd lifted off of the transom so many weeks ago. The clearing was about 300 yards away. She tried to speak to the guard. "Silence now!" He jammed the barrel of gun into her back. As they approached the site, a terrible stench preceded their arrival. As they reached the heaped up dirt, she peered over the edge and saw a jigsaw puzzle of decaying bodies. She wouldn't beg. She heard the sounds of the sentry lifting his rifle. Mother spun around to face him. Wait, please, let me say a prayer." It was then that she recognized the sentry's young eyes. He was a teenager, barely strong enough to lift his weapon. "Niet! Please, For my child, please." She pulled the crucifix out of her coat with her right hand. She held it over her husband's head and said, "May God be with you." She held it over her daughter's head. "May God be with you." And then she held it towards the boy holding the gun. "May God be with you." He lifted his gun and pulled the trigger. He pushed the father into the pit. The soldier raised his rifle again. He fired a second round. He pushed the mother into the pit. Then he fired a last shot into the air and pushed his gun around his back to free his arms. The little girl didn't understand. Then the soldier picked her up and handed her down into her mother and father's waiting arms. He whispered to the three of them standing in the pit, "May God be with you." And then he was gone.